Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the webinar. My name is Jehan Hakim. I am the chair of the Yemeni Alliance Committee. It's a team of Yemeni Americans from all fields that formed after the first Muslim ban, focusing on advocating for Yemeni Americans and resisting anti-Yemeni policies. Today, we are presenting, the name of the webinar is The War in Yemen. What's at stake? What can be done? And due to the recent victory, we want to know what just happened. Today we have with us two speakers who will be talking about just what we mentioned. The first one is Hassan El-Tayyab, who's a co-director of Just Foreign Policy, a national advocacy group that played a leadership role in House and Senate efforts to end the US-Saudi-led war in Yemen. One of the indispensable contributors to the Senate passage, which was on November 28th, which was SJ-Res 54, the War Powers Resolution to end US involvement in the Saudi-led war on Yemen. And Hassan coordinated a national grassroots lobbying effort. Over the last 2 years, he has been working to end the war in Yemen through direct lobbying, publishing his writings, grassroots organizing, speaking at rallies, living rooms and boardrooms, in addition to college campuses, the radio and the TV, and he has been really working to create a large platform for Yemeni voices to advocate for peace. We also have Shireen Al-Adeimi, who was born in Aden in Yemen and is now an assistant professor of education at Michigan State University. And through her writing and advocacy, she has been raising awareness about the US's role in the war in Yemen. Her recent articles can be found in These Times magazine, and she can be reached via Twitter at Shireen, SHIREEN 818. So first we'll turn it over to Shireen Al-Adeimi, who will help us understand what's at stake for the people of Yemen, who have been struggling for almost 4 years, suffering from the violence due to the conflicts in Yemen. Thank you, Shireen.
Thank you for having me, Jehan.
Do you have any family in Yemen, Shireen? How are they? And let us know kind of like what you're hearing from them.
I do. I have family all over Yemen in all the major cities, so Sana'a, Aden, Hodeidah, and Taiz. And honestly, people are struggling. This conflict has affected every single Yemeni, all 27 million of them in one form or another. It's, of course, called the worst humanitarian crisis on earth, and it's not an exaggeration. This is a UN designated, title, unfortunately, of just a crisis so large that it's unfathomable, that we've not seen in modern history an outbreak of cholera, for example, of over 1.3 million people. We've not seen the extent of the people facing hunger and starvation. We're talking half the population who's going to starve if this conflict doesn't end soon. So of course my family members are affected as much as, maybe not as much as other people. They've not, they're hanging in there. Many of them have lost their jobs, many of them have not. Some are displaced internally, some managed to leave early on in the war. And but most of them are just kind of hoping for good news, hoping for this to end. Everybody's tired of the conflict. They don't know if it's going to get any better, if the, whatever food remains in the country is going to be accessible to them. It's just widespread misery and widespread suffering all throughout Yemen.
I hear you. I also have family in Yemen and echo some of the same concerns. Can you briefly tell our listeners kind of what has been happening in Yemen over the last, almost 4 years now?
So I think if we can go back a couple years before that, in 2011, when Yemen was experiencing its Arab Spring moment, as many other Arab countries were at the time, it was a peaceful revolution. It didn't go as planned, of course, because different parties got involved and, the conflict turned violent. But since then, they had been trying to form some kind of unity government, and there was some hope that with a new president, it was President Hadi, who was the vice president of Saleh, that people hoped that there would be some kind of resolution, some kind of bringing together different factions who had maybe different interests, but were trying to make it work. This, of course, fell apart when Saudi Arabia began bombing in March of 2015. And what looked like a civil conflict or a civil war even ended up, descending into this chaos and the madness that we see today of an international attack. Really, we can't really call it a war. A war implies that there are two parties that are equally capable of inflicting harm. Whereas on the side of Yemenis, they're trying to get by without even an air force. And so it's this one-sided kind of attack. It's a coalition of several Arab countries supported by several Western allies, including the United States, militarily and logistically in all sorts of ways. And then bombarding a country that has not posed a threat to anyone, is not capable of defending itself. And this is why we see such a wide-scale humanitarian crisis unfold in Yemen today.
In addition to what you had mentioned, that the UN has designated Yemen as the world's worst humanitarian crisis in decades, perhaps a century, can you give us an idea of what those numbers look like, what that devastation looks like? Because the UN has also said that in Yemen, a child dies every 10 minutes due to hunger-related concerns or malnutrition. What do the numbers look like with respect to the number of casualties, the number of those malnourished? And I think like different outlets have different reportings, but based on your research and information, what does it look like on the ground with respect to the humanitarian crisis?
Well, the Yemen Data Project just released their latest numbers of the casualties, which is now at least 60,000 people. These are the people who've been killed in the violence. In addition to that, we know that in 2016, 50,000 children starved to death. And in 2017, 63,000 children starved to death. And so the numbers are really horrific. We're talking at least 113,000 children who are between the ages of 0 and 5 who've starved to death in just 2 out of the 4 years of the war. So if we add the numbers of, all people, children and adults, I'm honestly horrified to find out what those numbers are. We're talking probably a couple 100,000 people, if not more. And so, each life, to talk about even lives in terms of numbers, we thought that when it was 5,000 people killed, that would be enough. When it was 10,000 people killed, that would be enough. But now we're talking hundreds of thousands who've not only lost their lives through violence, but also, malnutrition. And the kids can't fight off diseases when they're struggling with hunger. Their immune systems are compromised. Cholera should not be something that people die of in a modern world where there's access to water, but our kids in Yemen are starving and they're, not having access to clean water, and then, getting infected with something like cholera and not able to recuperate from something that should just be so easy to treat. And so preventable diseases like cholera and diphtheria and other kind of diseases have spread. Dengue fever, for example, is another one of those killers. But the one life is too many, but the numbers I think are really horrific.
Thank you for sharing. It's devastating every time I hear it.
Yeah.
I follow you closely on Twitter, Shireen. Let me know, or let our listeners know, what you've been doing to kind of raise awareness about the stagnant war in Yemen and the humanitarian crisis.
Well, I actually created my Twitter account the day the bombing started on March 26, 2015. And the reason I did that was because I was trying to find more information. I remember a cousin years ago telling me that if you really wanted to find out what's going on in the world, you go to Twitter. And I found myself looking for information because I knew from family back home that this war was going on, that it started, but there wasn't much information or any information at all on, on mainstream media sources at the time. And I've kind of dedicated my page to raising awareness to an American audience. Mostly I live here in the US. And so trying to direct people to not only understand what's going on, but more importantly, understand the US's role in the conflict. The US, until very recently, is refueling jets mid-air. They're providing logistical support to the Saudis. They're Green Berets, special forces at the Saudi-Yemen border. They are updating and maintaining vehicles and aircraft for the Saudis. They're training their soldiers in all sorts of ways. And so the extensive support is something that's not authorized by Congress, that the US public largely doesn't know about, is just now starting to learn more about it. And so from the beginning, I've been trying to press my Congress people and my senators at the time back in Massachusetts about ending the war. And it started by writing letters and making those letters publicly available so people can borrow that language. if they're not used to contacting their senators and congresspeople. And has since moved toward, advocacy in different ways, speaking engagements and speaking on the radio and, writing in these times and other outlets, just to try to get the word out on Yemen and keep it within the consciousness, and then also to direct people of, specific things to do in order to help end the war in Yemen.
Thank you, Shireen. Yeah, I think Yemen has been called the forgotten war. I think it's mainly because it's not being talked about. So oftentimes I'll meet folks and they won't even know that Yemen is suffering, and they won't even know that we're supporting and backing that suffering. So thank you for everything that you do. I wanted to pass it over to Hassan Al-Tayyab, who will help us understand what is being done on a legislative end to end U.S. support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen, and who also help give us an update as to what just happened, because a lot of us in these circles are, really rejoicing, but we'll get to that later. Welcome, Hassan.
Hey, thank you so much for hosting us.
Of course, I wanted to talk about, before we talk about the recent victory, help our listeners understand, the U.S. began backing the Saudi-led coalition in 2015. Was there anything done at that time to thwart our support for the war?
So I wanted to back it up just a little bit as well. So under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, Congress has the power to declare war. And as Shireen mentioned, this war was never authorized by Congress. And Congress has, over the years since World War II, hasn't actually declared war. So at the height of the Vietnam War, people in Congress were really upset about U.S. involvement, not only in Vietnam, but the secret wars in Laos and Cambodia. And so what they did is they came together, and over a Nixon veto, they passed a resolution called the War Powers Act of 1973. And that's the vehicle that we've used to try to pressure Congress here. And so I wanted to just give a little background. Now, a lot of voices have been very silent for a long time under the Obama administration since the start of this war. And it's been very unfortunate because, as Shireen mentioned, there's been so much humanitarian suffering. There was a vote on cluster bomb sales, which was good. It helped raise awareness, but we actually haven't had a vote on Yemen essentially, we haven't really had a vote on Yemen until an official binding vote until tonight. And that's really sad to say. So let me go a little bit into the legislative history of what happened. So in 2017, Representatives Khanna and Pocan introduced H-Con Res 81, which again invoked the War Powers Resolution I mentioned before. And because it basically just asks Congress to weigh in on the matters of war, where our military is being used. And our military has been essential for the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen, in their war in Yemen. We've been helping with targeting assistance and mid-air refueling of Saudi warplanes. And on top of that, we really have enabled the coalition to function with the sale of weapons to the coalition. So we are deeply involved. Now, the vote on H-Con Res 81 never actually happened. There was a big push to get co-sponsors and to press for a vote. And under the War Powers Resolution, the exciting thing about it is that any member, regardless of whether or not they are in the Foreign Affairs Committee or whatever committee you're involved in, can introduce this bill and within 15 days force a vote. And that's why it's such a powerful vehicle. But Ro Khanna made a compromise with House leadership in 2017 in November. And then they pushed for a bill called HR 599, which was a non-binding resolution. And that passed overwhelmingly. And what that did, while the war raged on, the progress that was made was the fact that this was the first time Congress actually admitted that we were even at war. And it was the first time we admitted that we were refueling Saudi warplanes. I mean, Shireen could have told you that. Everyone knew that we were doing this, but the wheels of legislative process are very slow sometimes. So then the Senate took up another bill in March of 2018, and that was introduced by Senator Bernie Sanders, Senator Lee, and Senator Murphy. And that was an independent, a Republican, and a Democrat. So again, another bipartisan bill. And that was actually, pretty much the same language, war powers resolution and U.S. military involvement in the Saudi war in Yemen. It would go after targeting assistance and mid-air refueling. And that was tabled with 44 senators voted to proceed with SJRS 54, but they just didn't get the majority that they needed. Now, over the summer, the bloodshed and the violence in Yemen went up, and it was just really sad. Saudi Arabia began their siege on Hodeidah, and that further constricted the last lifeline of Yemen, and trying where a lot of humanitarian aid got into the country. So this was a very devastating time and moment. In August 9, this was, I think, one of the first times, unfortunately, that the international community really woke up to the horror in Yemen, as when a Lockheed Martin missile, a laser-guided Lockheed Martin missile, sold by the United States corporations to Saudi Arabia, was launched from a Saudi Arabian warplane and hit a school bus and killed 44 children on their way to a field trip. And there were these images that went around of the UNICEF backpacks on the ground, and it was really horrible, and it woke everyone up. And I think that was a big reason that inspired Representative Khanna, Representative Pocan, two Republicans, Representative Massey and Jones. And then we added one more representative, who was very important, Representative Adam Smith, who was the ranking Democrat on House Armed Services, and that's a key committee for the usage of the usage of U.S. military force. So that was introduced, H-Con Res 138. It was, again, similar language to H-Con Res 81, another war powers resolution. And again, this is almost like a zombie piece of legislation. You can just keep introducing it over and over again and force a vote. And it's so imperative, because before this, like I mentioned before, we hadn't had a vote. And we, when Congress isn't forced to vote on something, they don't have to weigh the pros and cons. They don't have to listen to constituents about it. They basically just get to continue on, and the administration is, totally responsible. Now, that bill, got a lot more support. Shireen was, and yourself, Jehan, was critical in that. I want to give you a ton of props for the work you did to get Nancy Pelosi to co-sponsor that bill. And the Yemeni Alliance Committee, the Yemeni Freedom Council, Action Corps, they actually protested in front of Pelosi's office, and were able to secure her co-sponsorship, which was absolutely critical in this whole conversation. So I want to applaud you for all your great activism. And Shireen as well, just being an amazing voice for this whole movement and push for passing this war powers resolution. So that vote, it did actually lose. It was, I believe, 201 to 187. And let me just explain, I know there's a lot of information here, sorry. The privileged status. So oftentimes you don't just get a vote. You get a motion to strip the bill of this privileged status. So we can, and so what the House did was say, are we going to get rid of the expedited status of this piece of legislation? And so that's what they actually voted on. And it narrowly lost by, I believe, maybe 14 votes in the House. But the Senate was continuing to move as well. And obviously, the Saudi Arabia's cold-blooded murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the U.S. resident and Washington Post journalist, really added fuel to the fire and rage about what's happening, and called into question the entire U.S.-Saudi alliance. And so that enraged lots of members of Congress that are normally in the pro-Saudi camp, like Lindsey Graham, Corker, Representative Flake, even Representative Rubio came out strongly against Saudi Arabia. And that, on top of what Representative Khanna and Pocan did, caused them to reintroduce SJ Res 54, the bill that got shot down. And so on the wind of getting Nancy Pelosi to co-sponsor, Chuck Schumer said, we want Democrats to be united. And we got 49 Democrats and I think about 14 Republicans to vote to advance on the motion to get a full floor vote on SJ Res 54. So that passed with 63 senators voting for it. So as we came a long way from 44 senators in March to 63 senators in November. So then what happened tonight essentially is that same bill. So because they advanced the bill and pushed it forward, tonight we got our actual clean up or down vote. And I am really happy to say that 56 senators voted for SJ Res 54, and the amendment in the Senate to end the bill to end U.S. involvement in the Saudi war in Yemen passed. And this is the first time in 45 years since the War Powers Resolution of 1973 was passed by Congress. It's the first time it actually passed in the Senate, and it's an absolutely historic day, and it really couldn't have happened without so many hundreds of thousands of activists, and obviously in Jehan and Shireen, you were at the forefront of this movement. So just congrats to everybody. Obviously we have a long way to go, but the power of this could not be understated. Could not be overstated. Where on the same day as this vote happened, you had the UN Special Envoy, Martin Griffith. He's in peace talks right now in Sweden with the Hadi government and the Houthis. And they had a historic day. I mean, they agreed to exchanging 15,000 prisoners between the two sides. And they also agreed to a ceasefire in the province of Hodeidah and are allowing humanitarian aid workers in there to open up more food into the country. And more food, medicine, and fuel. Are we out of the woods yet? We are not out of the woods yet, but this is major progress.
Thank you for that, Hassan. That was really thorough, and I wanted to also congratulate, Shireen and everyone who has been using the hashtag SJRes54, hashtag Yemen can't wait. I've said it before that our voices and our efforts are significant, and they do listen if we press them. And I think it's because of our collective organizing and advocacy, we were able to also, help impact that vote. So yes, congratulations to everybody. And the fight does continue. So my last question to both of you is, what's next, and how can everyday Americans who are, let's say, apolitical, join this fight to end U.S. support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen? Like, what can they do?
You want to go, or would you like me?
Maybe you should go first, Hassan, because I think what's next has to do a lot with Congress moving through with these bills.
Yeah. So, so what happened today was historic. Now, where do I start? Okay, so while we passed in the Senate, that doesn't make it a law. But the psychological, movement here gives Martin Griffith tremendous leverage in peace talks. So the end goal is to end the war. That is the end goal, and we want a ceasefire. We want an end to hostilities. So I think there's a possibility that we get there, even if we don't pass the War Powers Resolution. But that said, we should keep pressing on and moving forward with every tool we have available here. So the House did not pass their version, as I mentioned. They actually reintroduced a new one, HCon Res 142, and that was voted on yesterday. And that vote lost its vote by 206 to 203. So 3 votes shy of winning. And we just get closer and closer. So we're making a tremendous progress, and that's very important. So unfortunately, Paul Ryan, excuse me, I just had a LaCroix. So I gotta, so Paul Ryan introduced the rule on that bill, basically stripped HCon Res 142 of its privilege, but they added another provision in there which said that we could not bring up another Yemen War Powers Resolution for the rest of the 115th Congress. And this is unprecedented. No, that's never happened before, and it's a pretty horrible thing to do. And as he leaves being Speaker of the House and he leaves Congress, he leaves with this terrible legacy. So we are moving forward in the 116th Congress. What needs to happen is the Senate actually needs to vote again on SJ Res 54 or a bill with a new name. And then the House also has to pass one. So I believe that the talk is that we're trying to get Nancy Pelosi to introduce another War Powers Resolution, and really maybe not her introduce it, probably it would be Ro Khanna or Pocan, but that she would support it and whip Democrats to make sure it passes. And we already know we have the votes in the Senate, so I think we're in good shape. So we have to kind of keep moving on that front. There are other things that we should be pressing for, is that we can ask Senator Schumer to push for in appropriations, because another power that Congress has on top of the power to declare war is the power to fund the government and fund war. So we should be pressing Congress to do everything they can to stop U.S. military involvement and cut that through appropriations. So one, we got to, again, just ask our senators and members of Congress to support any War Powers Resolution to end U.S. involvement in the Saudi war in Yemen. We can do that without a bill number. So just call them up and just say, this is what we want. We can still rack up co-sponsors for HCon Res 142. So call your member of Congress and have them co-sponsor HCon Res 142. And then everyone should be asking House leadership, including Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer in particular, to make ending the war in Yemen a top foreign policy priority in the 116th Congress.
Thank you, Hassan. Shireen?
Yeah, I think I would encourage people to continuously call their senators and their congresspeople now that they know what the process is and what the rest of this battle looks like for all of us. We really can't give up. This is a victory indeed, but it's one step that got us closer to achieving the goal of ending the U.S.'s support for the war in Yemen. But Jehan, if you don't mind, I want to conclude with bringing up voices of Yemenis living in Yemen currently. I had asked on Twitter for people to describe to me what their situation is like and to speak to the American people. And I thought maybe a few people would respond. I got nearly 1,000 responses, and I translated 100 of those responses in an article for In These Times. And if I can just read a couple, these are people living in Yemen. A woman named Yasmin Ali. She said, "Dear American people, we speak with you in the name of humanity. Help us to stop the war in Yemen. Your great country, America, is the one that sells weapons to the coalition to bomb Yemen. Your great country, America, is the one that gave the green light to strike Yemen." And other people go on to explain just the horrors of their daily lives. One person said, Badr al-Qasim said, "Money and oil buys the world to destroy and kill Yemenis." And another person said, "Yemenis live between life and death." And so I think that for people to just understand the incredibly devastating impact this has had on the average person in Yemen, who has nothing to do with politics, who has nothing to do with war or anything like that. People just want to resume their daily lives. They want to be able to go to school and have a family and live in safety, just like any person living in anywhere in the world would want. I think we should continue to keep them in mind and to continue to use whatever power we have here in this country to make that happen for them.
Thank you both. Audience, I hope that today you have a little bit more clarity as to kind of, how the legislative process looks like. And while we're looking at the majority vote of SJ Res 54 passing as remarkable, the fight is not over. And we still encourage folks to call on their lawmakers. Just remember that we are who elected them. They are there to represent us. Essentially, they serve us, right? So they have to, listen to our demands. So every American citizen has a right to call, email, visit their lawmakers and demand that they don't want their tax dollars or their country involved in the Saudi-led war in Yemen that has killed thousands and starved even more. Thank you so much to our speakers. I just wanted to remind folks to follow Just Foreign Policy that Hassan works for, and also Shireen is on Twitter, super active. You can just retweet her her posts and then use the hashtag to kind of keep up the momentum. She's at Shireen818, and then also please follow the Yemeni Alliance Committee for tools and updates. Thank you so much. See you later.